this panel is about innovation and sustainability. It's about innovation in climate resilience. As we heard before, innovation is one crucial driving force for adaptation and mitigation to climate change. And we need to understand how innovation can be steered and how it can be implemented in a way that can actually help the transition to a sustainable pathway. So it's about aligning capital allocation and rewinding finance through innovation. The programming partner of this panel is UN SDSN and Climate-KIC Greece. I will very briefly define the partners, just give you a bit background on the partners, but I think it's not needed because I did it before. Very briefly, I'm going to say that the United Nations Sustainable Development Network is co-chaired by Andreas and myself. This is the Greek hub, and the idea is to help science-driven implementation of the 17 SDGs, the Sustainable Development Solutions, and the Sustainable Development Goals of Agenda 2030 of the United Nations. And the idea is to transmit science-driven solutions from research and academia to the other stakeholders, as I said before, business, NGOs, civil society, policymaking, and politicians. And there is an urgency to do so, as we said before, because we have very few years left, like a decade, before we face the point of no return, the point where the change in climate will be irreversible and will have a very negative impact, unprecedented impact on the weather, floods, droughts, extreme weather conditions, and it will it will bring hunger and poverty to millions of people. So the situation is urgent and serious, and this panel will identify the ways that that innovation can help this transition. The other partner, as I said, is Climate-KIC, is a major European initiative that tries to accelerate innovation in order to achieve transformation of the current state of affairs in the economy to a zero-emission economy. I want to just close this introduction by re-emphasizing the achievements of Climate-KIC, many partners, many engaging partners, a lot of new startups, clean energy startups, green shipping startups, social innovation startups have been financed and have been accelerated into the market, have produced jobs and had a serious effect on society and economy. I would close it here because I've presented the programs of the KIC before and just introduce our panel, which is an interesting mixture of people that are pioneers in the implementation of sustainability and in understanding how you integrate innovation, technological and social innovation in your socio-economic plans in order to be able to implement sustainability, in order to be able to construct and implement financial economic plans and allocate investments in a way that your economy becomes sustainable. So the first speaker of our panel is Professor Andreas Papandreou, co-chair of United Nations Sustainable Development Network in Greece, and one of the first professors in Greek in economics that actually dealt seriously with pricing climate change and integrating the cost and value of conservation into economic analysis. Andreas, how do you think this transition can be accelerated through innovation? And what is the structure of this, what structure does this innovation need to take in order to really be efficient in terms of accelerating the economy?
Hello, thanks for having us here as well from me. First, I think it's important, we use the term climate resilience, and usually the term climate resilience refers to the capacity of the economy and society to adapt to climate change. So how resilient we are in terms of being able to find ways to adapt to climate change. In terms of our focus here, we're looking at innovation that will both have to do with innovation that's going to promote better ways to adapt to climate change, but I'll use the term climate resilience in a slightly broader sense because we're looking at innovations abroad, at least another two key areas. One is, we can say, the extent to which economies have the capacity to control the environment, in other words, to reduce climate change gases, to actually protect the environmental services of the climate. So that's one sense in which we can say there's a resilience and we need to innovate for mitigating climate change gases. And another sense is to the extent that the economies actually achieve, and that's of course what we're all hoping for, the low carbon transition, the economies also have to be resilient to that. That's going to be a very revolutionary change in terms of the whole functioning of the society. And economies that are not up to speed are either going to end up having a lot of stranded assets, infrastructure that's going to lose its value, or they're going to stop being competitive in a world in which the economy is moving into a new paradigm. So in that sense, we have innovation across three different dimensions that are very critical. Now, I'll focus a little bit more on the mitigation side of the innovation equation and try to say a few things about the broad historical background of energy transitions and what lessons we can draw from those energy transitions. Now, there have been 5 major energy transitions in recent history, so over the last 200 years. We started with the rise of coal and in conjunction with production of cotton. In terms of infrastructure, that meant the building of canals. We moved towards producing steel, iron, and again, coal becoming a critical part of that energy transition, and infrastructure moving from canals to railroads. Then we had a move towards electricity, which was spearheaded by Germany and spread to other countries. Then the one that we're most familiar with is the major oil transition, which took place in the early part of last century. And we could say that the 5th transition is the information communications technology transition, which is not, as it were, directly associated with energy, but of course, in terms of our future outlook, that could be a key in helping to move towards sustainability transition. So the real challenge now is in terms of those past transitions, how are we going to move towards a low carbon energy transition? How are we going to move to a different era? Now, there's certain general patterns that we can draw and lessons we can draw from these transitions in the past. First of all, they're major socio-technological transitions of the entire economy. Things taking place in terms of infrastructure changing, forms of production changing, lifestyle changes, urban planning changes, and we have to understand that that's the kind of transition we now have to bring about with the low carbon transitions. Most of these transitions took place in terms of the drivers were not the price. In other words, it wasn't that these new forms of energy were cheaper, but that they provided services that weren't available before. So they were driven by the market, by a desire for new activities, whether it's light bulb, whether it's the automobile. So the market was a major force behind these transitions. Now, in every case, they were also policy-enabled. They were not policy-driven. They were enabled by a government or governments who understood the new potential, aligned with new interests, because there was always a fight between vested interests, the old style and structures, and the new styles. And you can see the history in each case of where the major fights took place: railroads versus canals, automobiles versus other forms, and so forth. But the government played a very important part, along with the market forces, to build the infrastructure. Sometimes we talk about subsidies for solar energy, and we say we shouldn't be subsidizing, the government shouldn't go into the place. If we look at back in history at the role of governments in helping the transitions, let's say to the automobile era, there's a huge infrastructural and investment program on all fronts: research, exploration of oil, and so forth. So the government has to play a very strong and active role. A key difference, now all of these transitions took many decades, sometimes a century to go. The main challenge we're facing today is that this transition, and that's an imperative that has to do with the specifics of the climate change catastrophe that we have in front of us, is that we have a very specific time frame within which we have to make that transition. That's never been the case in the past. And also, a lot of the services that are provided by the friendly energy sources are not providing specially new commodities, so there's not the market that's going to drive these. Therefore, they have to be not simply enabled by policy, they have to be driven by policy. And so in many respects, that's the key challenge. Now, maybe, I don't know in terms of time, one thing that I want to talk about, but I can get back to that later, is one of the key discussions right now. We've seen it, it was discussed earlier. Just recently, we had a letter by more than 3,000 economists in the United States, 27 Nobel laureates. There's never been such a, in terms of collection of signatures, such a mass of economists coming out and saying that we need a carbon tax. A carbon tax is the only way to drive these kind of drastic change in the way the society functions, the way the economy functions. And an interesting element of this new and innovative aspect of what they're saying is that all the proceeds, all the revenues, and that's something we can discuss, that are gained from the carbon tax should go back to the citizens on a per capita basis. Because you need popular support. People don't like taxes. If you do that, people will feel, and especially the poorer parts, will get an increase in the amount of money they can use for energy sources. And of course, that deals with the problem that Macron had with the yellow vests, because you saw the reaction to a slight increase in energy taxes. The other new thing is the Green New Deal, which has a different philosophy, but maybe I'll talk about that if that comes up in the discussion.
Yes, thank you, Andreas. Let me just add that the US initiative that has been signed by prominent figures with regards to promoting the carbon tax. There is a parallel initiative. I'm co-leading this initiative in Europe and will most probably be signed at the beginning of May at the Mediterranean Union meeting. So Europe is acting in parallel with regards to this. So a lot is going on. As I said before, the technology is there, the resources are there, the political will is the final tick box. And political will is driven by people, so we have to engage people in one way or another. I'm very happy that Thanh Lee, the director of Climate-KIC Mediterranean, is here with us. It's one of the partners of this session and one of the, as I said before, a major initiative for this transition to carbon-free economy. What is difficult, Thanh, is to try to solve local problems that are relevant to climate change, and at the same time respond to this global issue of climate change. So how replicable are the local effects and how scalable are they? Is it possible to really have a holistic and global reaction to this problem, or does it have to be a very expensive case-by-case intervention?
So first of all, ευχαριστώ σας for the invitation, and it's a great honor to be a part of this Delphi Economic Forum and Andreas. So what I would like to say is indeed that, in fact, you have answered in the question. And the whole thing we have to deal with looks like a logical impossibility. So if we talk about mitigation, which is, of course, a very important dimension of the problem, in a way, there is something simpler with mitigation, which is that almost everybody agrees on what the objective is and how you measure it. For adaptation, in particular, the situation is totally different because we know we have problems with metrics, the way we measure, but that's not just a scientific problem, it's also a societal and a political problem. So I will just name one example, which is a conversation we had before COP21 in a day on finance and climate. And a major insurer, international insurer, said, well, you know, I don't have anything against investing on climate action, and we could invest billions. The problem is that what you're talking about is investments of tens of billions over 10 to 15 years. And because you don't know, you being the scientists, but being the citizens, being the innovators, you don't know what exactly you want to measure on adaptation. The probability is that over the course of the 15 years, you will change 5 times your government. And every time what was positive before becomes negative and incentives become counter-incentives. So I'm not against climate action, but as a financial person, I just won't invest in something that is so uncertain. So in fact, the problem also is the tension between the local, as you said, and the global. So is the solution to do uniquely massive investments at local scales on a case-by-case basis? I don't have to be an economist to know that it is just not possible, it's not realistic in financial terms. On the other hand, there is no denying that adaptation challenges are very local. So maybe just 3 quick illustrations of how we can try to reconcile those impossibilities with innovation. So the first thing is precisely about this tension between local and global. So something that is not so well known, even among scientific circles, is that there is a wealth of data available on not just the climate indicators, but also the indicators which are not climate data, but which are impacted by climate. So that's about water, that's about soil degradation, etc., etc. What we don't know is that, in fact, those data which are widely available are almost impossible to use for public or private decision in terms of investment plans. Why? Because they're completely dispersed and disparate. So even scientifically, we are not able to gather those data and make sense of them. So one of the things we want to do is, as Climate-KIC, is to support the efforts to set up tools that are just going to collect and analyze systemically those data, collect them in the intention of authorizing some decision-making at regional level. Because in a way, what is global is easier. You know, I'm not saying it's easier to sign the Paris Agreement, and it's much easier to withdraw from it. But it's much more difficult to act at regional scales in a way that is consistent with the global challenge. So that's one way to go. A second example is what you do with climate services. So climate services are an interesting example, and something that the European Commission is watching very carefully, because everybody or almost agrees that you can't get to adaptation at scale without a dissemination of climate services on the ground. The problem is, what is a climate service? There's already a lot of disagreement on that. What we found in a project called Marco H2020 project is that the majority of users of climate services today don't know that it has anything to do with climate. So it doesn't matter if they actually use the climate information, but the problem is that it doesn't disseminate just because other users in the same organizations don't know that climate information can be beneficial for their own development and for their own resilience. So in fact, what we need is to develop a shared understanding and vision of what could be the market of climate services, what could be the drivers. And when I say market, it's not just commercial market. It's also, you know, just exchange of information that is relevant for action. And in fact, have this disseminated very deep in the sectors but not by top-down initiative, but really by shared understanding. And this mapping is a very difficult exercise, but that's something that, for instance, Europe could invest on by setting up an observatory of this market of climate services. And the third example, not to take too much time, is around a project that I like to explain because it's a nice illustration of what you can do with multidisciplinary innovation. So this project is called WINNERS. Some of you might be familiar with that. So WINNERS has a very ambitious and simple goal in a way, which is to increase the agricultural output in African countries, so in the east of Africa, for instance, and at the same time, fight hunger in the continent, but also increase the climate resilience of those areas. And so when you try to do that, in fact, there are programs at world level from the World Bank, for instance, from the World Food Program, which have literally billions ready to be invested on those farmers, and nothing happens. Why? Because the farmers still have to take some of the risk on their shoulders, and they can't do it. So finally, we started in Climate-KIC with a consortium with Imperial College and other partners to see what do you need to put in this chain of action to unlock just this potential for action. It's not about the finance. The finance is there. How do you make it useful for the local players? And so then you put a mix of science, which is having an estimation of the risk that those small farmers are facing at a granularity that is suitable for a small exploitation. Then you put some training to the farmers to have more resilient practice. But also, and that's maybe more surprising, you have to work with policymakers to create a whole chain of regulations at local level in Tanzania, but also across the boundaries that allow, in fact, a chain of insurance contracts from the very small insurer to the global insurer to just cover the whole chain. And in fact, the magic of it, which is very simple to explain, is that if you can have a whole chain of climate action that has a risk shared between the shareholders, and in particular, you can put more load on those less vulnerable actors who are the final consumer, who are the exporter, then you make it possible for the farmer on the ground to actually not only, insure themselves against the risks and the existential risks, but really to improve their practice because it's actually sustainable and profitable for them. So this project, in fact, has managed, is managing now to unlock some of this food aid program, and now it's attracting investment banks. It's magic because there's no new money in the lot. It's just using the capacity that we have to finance to actually reach the target you want to have. So just those three examples, there are many more, of course, but those three examples show that you have to go very deep on the ground and go to very local problems, but be obsessed with the idea that you need to have replicable solutions, and you try to find the magic mix between
Exactly, exactly. And WINNERS is one of the many programs that the Climate-KIC is running, and it's important to disseminate this information that the Greek Hub is also running some relevant Greek-based initiatives that are important. And let me repeat again, the acceleration program, identifying startups or mature ideas that can be accelerated into the market. We have selected the first 5 such ideas. One has to do with hydrogen and using hydrogen for energy, but many others ideas that are can have huge potential for the transition of the Greek economy. The other program that the Climate-KIC Hub in Greece is running is the Pioneers into Practice, exchange of professionals for engaging and learning and being trained about green practices, both in shipping and green energy, and also the Climathos, that are large global awareness events that we run at the municipality level. Last year, we ran Climathons for Athens, Heraklion, Patras, and also Piraeus. And this year, we plan to have more than 10 cities. And all this is going on simultaneously, globally, more than 300 cities around the world. So it is important to know that things are happening within the country, and we are trying to embrace what Climate-KIC Europe is doing and integrate it into our practices, but also trying to influence policy by achieving success in these practices. And one major issue that I am really interested in is that Dimitris Karavellas, CEO of WWF, he's been leading the organization for many years, and the work they are doing is amazing and has, I think, a very vast effect on how we understand in this country the way we live and interact with our environment. One very interesting issue is whether innovation is only about technology, or can we have other forms of innovation, and whether we are always looking at great solutions or whether we can have nature-based solutions. How do you integrate all these issues in the work of WWF?
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. And I just wanted to say I'm very happy to be here, and I'm very, very encouraged by the fact that this is the first time that the Delphi Economic Forum actually engages in discussions about climate change and solutions around this. So I think I'd like to acknowledge that, and I hope that in the future we'll see more of that. I'll try and be very, very quick and respond also to your question, Phoebe. The first point I really wanted to make is I just can't emphasize enough this need for urgency in this discussion. I think that we need to recognize that climate change is the defining challenge of our era, and we do face a global responsibility to heed the warnings of the scientific community and of civil society, and to respond in an unprecedented way in terms of scale and speed. I think Andreas already made the point on speed. And I think it's within this context, actually, that we should be looking at the issue of innovation and the role that innovation can play. And I do think there is a lot to be said there, provided, of course, innovation is guided by the right vision and the right plan. And I want to come back to this afterwards. Now, on climate resilience in particular, but also in mitigation, I think at the stage we're at, there are a couple of things that we could say about innovation. Firstly, innovation in many cases might actually be about implementing the obvious. And let me just give you a quick example on this, and it goes to your question, Phoebe. Yep. Forest fires. We know that the Mediterranean is a region and Greece is a country where forest fires will become more frequent, and they will become more devastating in the future. We witnessed that in a tragic way last year with 100 lives lost in a forested area only 20 kilometers away from Athens. We witnessed the deadly mega fires in the Peloponnese in 2007, 2008. So this is a certainty. We know that. The question is, how do we prepare for that? And that's where the obvious comes in, because the obvious says that in adapting to that change, you need to look at, for example, changing your paradigm on how you address forest fires and putting a lot more emphasis on prevention than on suppression. Not engaging in a discussion about how many planes we have every year, but asking, where are the local fire prevention plans in place? Are there evacuation plans? Is there decent forest management? So in many cases, innovation may actually be implementing that obvious. The second point I wanted to make about innovation is it doesn't have to be complicated. It doesn't have to be rocket science. Innovation may actually be primarily about replication. We have been involved, we've been privileged to be involved in a project together with many other partners from the private sector, from academia, from local authorities on the island of Tilos. And Tilos is the first island that very soon will be powered in the Mediterranean, powered entirely by renewable energy. Now that's great news for Tilos, but of course the challenge there is replication. What do we learn from that? How do we create the mechanisms that can scale this up and at the speed that we need? And that's where, for example, initiatives like Climate-KIC, SDSN and others become become very, very important.
Let me just say that Unis Energy Group, who was one of the pioneers in the Delos project, is one of the consortium partners of the Climate-KIC hub in Greece. And a replication of that in other islands is one major initiative of the KIC. So.
And the third point I wanted to make on this is going back to Andreas' earlier point about the politics and the policies of climate change and how they may relate and encourage innovation or actually undermine it. At the World Economic Forum that took place in Davos about a month ago, the agenda was actually dominated, I would say, by climate change. Somebody mentioned in an earlier session presenting the global risks report that climate change is up there is I think, the number one, again, risk on a global level. At the same time, we're seeing an unprecedented reaction from civil society, especially youth, the last few months. Schools, Greta and her gang are really going for it. At the same time, if we look at the numbers and if we look at the politics, we're nowhere where we should be right now. So to Andreas' point about the historical aspect of how policies and politics actually drove that transition, that's what we need to see happen now. And that's where innovation can really play a role, but only if those policies and politics are driving that. Two holes down, the discussion is about how this country is going to bank on hydrocarbons for its future. Yeah, exactly. And sometimes you think, what? And it's not just a discussion here, it's a discussion in the news, it's a discussion everywhere,
And down in Cyprus as well.
Is this the future we want for this country, for this region? Is this our response to the global threat of climate change? We say no. From a financial perspective, from an environmental perspective, it makes no sense. So the point I'm trying to make is whether it's mitigation or adaptation, and where we want innovation to play a role, we need to get on the same page now. And we all need to recognize that bold climate action is a challenge for everyone, but we need to be playing to the same tune. Otherwise, the resilience becomes more and more difficult, whether it's gray or green or soft or hard.
Exactly.
I'll stop there.
Exactly. Dimitri Zenghelis, a researcher at the Grantham Institute for Climate Change, LSE. Dimitri, obviously, climate change presents many risks and dangers, but it also presents great opportunities. These great opportunities have to be steered and nurtured. How do you see that happening?
Okay, I'll try and be as quick as possible because we've got two speakers and only 13 minutes left. And by the way, I think it's staggering. I mean, I can't believe it. I'm still sort of getting my head around the fact this is the first time that climate has come up in the Delphi Economic Forum. Was it last year? I mean, we may as well all go. I can't help but make an observation. It's changed a little bit, but in a conference that's very much male-dominated, I would say the audience here are probably 80% female, just an observation for people to mull over. Anyway, I'm an economist, and by the way, as an economist, I have to say that carbon pricing is an important part of the story, but it will not solve the problem on its own.
Yes. We agree on that.
But I'm often asked, what's it going to cost to transition an economy into a low-carbon, sustainable future? And the answer is, of course, dependent on innovation. And innovation, answer the question, what is innovation, doesn't just mean technologies and widgets. Innovation is a much broader concept. It's about institutions, it's about behaviors, it's about technologies, of course, but it's important that we don't lock ourselves into infrastructures, physical infrastructures, and associated behaviors that allow us to go down a path which is high carbon. Thankfully, that's not happening, because years of investment has ensured that renewable technologies are entirely outcompeting fossil fuel technology. So if Greece is investing in lignite, good luck with that, because you're going to have to scrap your power stations before the end of their lives, because they'll be way too expensive, and then you'll transition to solar. Complete waste of resources if you go down that route. There's no serious auto manufacturer now that's investing limited R&D in combustion engines. It's all about electric. Renewables take the lion's share of investment the world over. Most electricity generation investment in the world is now renewables. Interesting if Greece decides to go the other way. So the answer to the question, whether we can transition and at what cost, is what economists call endogenous. It depends on what we want to do. Innovation doesn't happen in a vacuum. As Andreas said, innovation happens because we want it to happen, because we see results from making it happen. And expectations matter crucially in this regard. I once went skiing and I plowed straight into a tree, and my instructor said, you know what, if you want to avoid skiing into trees, look where you want to go, don't look where you don't want to go. And the economy is exactly like that. If we want to deliver a low-carbon solution, if you tell everybody climate change is a hoax, it's all too expensive, nobody's moving, then of course there's no mayor or business person or politician that will invest in low-carbon and renewables. If in fact you tell them, as is the case, that actually China's investing heavily, Europe's invested heavily, the US pre-Trump was investing heavily and still is at the local level. And indeed, by the way, have you noticed that India and China have not walked away from low-carbon investments because the Americans haven't? Why? Because they see it as an economic opportunity now, whereas 10 years ago they saw it as burden sharing. So you better move, because if you don't move, your competitors will steal a march. You'll miss out on these opportunities. The technology costs are coming down by 5-fold every decade, and the finance is no longer niche. If you don't move, you'll be left with all these stranded assets and you'll be in the wrong market. That dynamic of expectations will mean that people do invest, and the process of investment, learning by doing, experimenting with new technologies, is exactly what brings the cost down. The costs don't come down on their own. The innovation doesn't just happen on its own. It happens as part of this dynamic process. So I'll end by kind of expressing my gratitude to the Nobel Committee for giving Paul Romer the Nobel Prize this year. Paul Romer, together with Bill Nordhaus, we can talk about it afterwards if we had time. Bill Nordhaus, the static way of addressing climate change costs, which I believe is the wrong way. Paul Romer looks at it the right way. He looks at the dynamics of addressing a low-carbon solution, because he was part of a process that said economic growth doesn't just happen, you have to shake it. It's called endogenous growth theory. Previously, economists, if you can believe, thought that if you went to the beach for 10 years and just came back, you'd be 25% richer without having to do anything about it. Growth just happens. Paul Romer said, well, no, actually you have to invest, and his ilk, his colleagues, said, no, actually you have to invest in machines, you have to invest in people, in infrastructure, in skills, and only then will you generate the kinds of growth. And indeed, the investment interplays with the different assets you invest in. If you buy people lots of computers, they'll think of very clever things to do with them. Once they've thought of very clever things to do with computers, with new software, then it increases the incentive to buy more computers. And so it is with locking into a green pathway rather than a high-carbon pathway. That pathway is endogenous, as we are seeing now with the costs coming down and the opportunities outweighing the alternative scenarios in a high-carbon world. Paul Romer talked about something called complacent optimism, because people ask me, are you optimistic? I say, no, we've got a heck of a lot more to do. But complacent optimism is what he describes as the kind of outlook of a child who kind of just expects presents to happen. He talks about a better approach being conditional optimism, which is a child that says, well, you know what, there's some wood over there, I can get some kids on the block, and together we can build a tree house, and that can be really cool. They deliver what they want to happen. And indeed, with policy, it's the same with climate change. That we know one thing, the cost of decarbonization are going to be higher if we don't manage that transition, if the policy signals are mixed and muddled. It doesn't matter what those costs will be, that transition will be much more expensive if we don't manage it properly. So in answer to the question, what's it going to cost? As an economist, I would say, look, policymakers should stop asking economists that question, what the costs and benefits will be. And instead of trying to forecast the future, they should spend a lot more time trying to steer and design and build that future.
Thank you very much, Dimitris. I like the way you passionately speak about all these issues. And now Nick Keramidas, EU Affairs, Director of EU Affairs at Mytilineos Energy Group. Give us your understanding of the current situation with energy-intensive industries in the countries and how they fit into the more European framework and efforts, European efforts facilitating the green transition.
Well, let me start by saying, first of all, thank you for inviting me to this extremely interesting panel. I wanted to say that the pathway is already there. I mean, the European Commission already drafted a long-term decarbonization strategy for 2050, and it was published in November. So in order to reach a climate-neutral economy, we have ambitious scenarios there, which help reach our goals. And the Paris Agreement goals. The thing is that we're talking about a climate-neutral economy, right? And climate-neutral economy, like, well, climate change is global. And we need to sometimes remember that, for instance, Europe represents approximately 6% or 7% of global emissions currently. And China represents approximately 30%, and by 2030, if the Paris Agreement goals are met, we're going to be talking about 26 to 27%. So what I'm going to say is a bit less romantic, perhaps, less inspiring maybe, but it's the view of the energy-intensive industry and the challenges it faces. And unfortunately, they're huge, they're massive. So avoiding, well, I mean, we have to make sure that when we talk about a climate-neutral economy, we make sure that we go hand in hand with keeping our economy competitive on a global scale. So I'm going to talk about something that I know it's close to my heart, and actually the biggest plant is really close to this venue as well. We're talking about aluminium, for instance. It's an electro-intensive activity, and not many people understand that when we're talking about electro-intensity, it's not just play figures. We're talking about a very efficient aluminium smelter consuming the equivalent of 700,000 households per year. This is massive. This is huge. And that cost, electricity, represents approximately 40% of its overall production costs. So what we're exposed to is global competition, where our competitors don't bear costs like the ones we bear in Greece or Europe, that is. And we're talking about incremental policy-driven costs like ETS and so on, which are in the right direction. If you ask me, the ETS is a well-designed tool, well, after the reform, basically, and started producing some figures that actually matter, because prior to that, it was, well, basically crap. But so now, today, it's starting to build up and produce the figures that we want in order to drive decarbonization. But let me put it this way. In between, what we need is to avoid carbon leakage. And the use of this term is usually followed by the word risk. Well, in some industries, some sectors, we're way past calling it a risk. It's a reality, it's happening, and turning a blind eye to it is not going to make it less of a reality. I'm going to give you an example. In China, for instance, we used to have China representing approximately 10% of global production of aluminium.
Nick, can you conclude on the example so that we get a few questions from the audience and you come back?
Sure. I'm just going to say that today, China represents 60% of global aluminium production, and it's all powered by coal-fired stations. I understand your notion about China investing heavily on renewables, but the fact of the matter is for baseload electricity, they're still investing in carbon-fired electricity, and this is really unfortunate. And there's no offsetting, no sufficient offsetting for the rest of the industry, well, in Europe, for instance. So what I'm going to say is that energy-intensive industries commonly regarded as the villain in the energy transition story, because, well, basically every story must have a villain. So unfortunately, it's not that way. The energy-intensive industry is investing heavily in the transition, and we want to make it. We're actually running a massive exercise under the auspices of the European Commission currently, which is called Corporate Sourcing of Renewable Electricity. We're investing heavily in that. The Innovation Fund that was adopted, agreed upon this week, is a step in the right direction. We hope that many measures will follow suit, but in the meantime, we must make sure that we somehow, with well-designed regulatory framework, we offset this competitive disadvantage that the European industry is faced with? I'm going to give you some more examples afterwards if we have the time. Thanks.
Excellent. Are there any questions, thoughts, comments, interventions that you would like us to react to? No. Yeah.
Eleni Atsikbasi, I'm a founder of Healing Lesvos and the wider Aegean. It's okay? Yeah. So yeah, the question is, when do we start to implement all these methodologies that we're discussing here? Because, you know, I've been working on something for 3 years now, and Phoebe, I'm so fortunate to have met you recently as well. So science is coming to a social impact, and so working in Lesvos and the islands around the Aegean is very important for me to create the first of the diving parks, to create soft protection at least. How do we start that now?
Well, there is a methodology. There is a prevailing methodology of making the transition, and I've presented it before. I think it's important to understand the coordinates of the framework, understand what natural resources we have, what human resources we have, who are the stakeholders, what are the institutions, and what capacity they have, and then understand the way economy, society, and nature interact, and based on that understanding, implement models that will allow us to identify optimal solutions and integrate different innovation instruments, social innovation instruments, financial instruments, legal instruments, and so on, and come up with sustainable plans. And this is an exercise that has been done many times in the past for many case studies, for many countries, for other regions. I don't think that we don't know how to go forward. We just need greater force from policy, and I can see only one politician that I know of in this audience. Where are the rest? To really understand that there is a way, and it is like the only way available in terms of we need to make the transition now. I was in Rome a few weeks ago. I was speaking to big energy companies like Dong Energy and Statoil and Eni, and I just said, either you like it or not, the transition is happening, you might as well get the first mover advantage, and they understand all this. I think policy and policy making and politicians need to empower all these efforts. And I hope that next year the Delphi Economic Forum will have a higher level, higher profile, and better integrated with policy-making sessions on the environment.
And though we have no time, I think also the point made, civil society, individuals have a big role to play, changing their perceptions. We're seeing with the high school students, and we're seeing it with divestment movements, we're seeing it with, so policy, they should put the pressure on the policymakers, along with the new renewable interests, to make these changes.
One very fast question, just speak up loudly.
Depends what
it is.
I'm a policymaker, I'm a citizen and a poet, but speaking as a citizen who feels very passionate about everything that's been said here, I do get overwhelmed, and I often wonder, how do we mobilize citizen action, but more important, what citizen action is effective? Because I've protested many times, I've written many letters. What can citizens be doing? What should we be doing to mobilize action?
First of all, I think what is crucial is not to know what to do as citizens. Citizens' actions are motivated and incentivized not exogenously but endogenously. What is crucial, and what is crucial for our country, and I believe in this very intensively, is understanding. Knowledge shapes value, and value shapes action. If there is understanding of the urgency of avoiding self-destruction and how close this self-destruction is to our living, to our life, then this will create action. What we are missing in the country and around the world is understanding. So we need to educate people. Education takes a lot of time. We don't have so much time anymore, but we need to continue on investing on education, climate change, because this will be a continuous problem. But we need to quickly train people, make them aware. Once you make people aware, they have the power and the force to vote for the right people to do the right action. But they need to know, just like they know how their economic situation affects their livelihood, they need to know how the environmental situation will affect them. And very soon, it's not about the next generation anymore, it's about this generation.
Sorry, I was just going to add, you also want to influence the men in the grey suits who are all sort of in the other rooms talking about proper growth, not the sort of touchy-feely stuff that the greenies talk about, which is just going to destroy the planet, by the way. And to do that, I work for something called the New Climate Economy, and we said that actually you can get between 50 and 90% of the way to a full low-carbon transition to 2 degrees in the next 5 years, a time period that politicians care about, without any impact on growth. In fact, positive impacts through energy efficiency, through lower pollution of particulates, through energy security and all the rest of it. So you need to tell them, yes, there's difficult decisions to be made, but while we talk about the difficult decisions, let's get on with all the stuff that's going to be in consumers, in electorates, in politicians, in business people, and in citizens' interests that can both reduce emissions and build a cleaner, quieter, safer, and more environmentally friendly, and more efficient, innovative, and productive world.
Thank you.